Hello and welcome to The Fairy Folk, the podcast that takes you on a magical tour to discover the myth and the magic of the United Kingdom without leaving the comforts of your own home. We're off again on a new adventure. Today we're leaving England behind and travelling to a country known for its stunning mountainous regions, unique language, and of course its connection to some of the United Kingdom's most famous myths and legends. It's time to visit Wales. In this episode, we will be discovering two classic Welsh stories that feature a couple of legendary creatures that I'm sure you've heard of. Today's tales take place in the scenic Welsh countryside, and both feature prominently as part of Wales's rich storytelling history. But before we get started, I'd like to take this moment to apologise in advance for my pronunciation of some of the Welsh names in the upcoming myths. I promise I've researched them as best as I can, but there's only so much a native English woman can do, so I hope you'll bear with me. Alright then. Let's get ready to meet some dragons and the devil. For our first story, we'll need to travel to Dinas Emrys, a hill in the county of Gwynedd, northwest Wales. Dinas Emrys is part of the beautiful Snowdonia National Park, which is also home to the tallest mountain in Wales, Snowdon. And as we climb high into the hills, you will see beautiful panoramic views, fluffy clouds suspended low in the sky, and the vast rivers and lakes reaching out beneath you. And so, it's time to begin our first tale, the origin of one of Wales's most famous emblems, and mythology's most famous wizards. This is the story of the dragons of Dinas Emrys. The story begins with a terrifying shriek. There was nothing that could compare to the horrifying, bone-rattling noise that spread across the land every May Day. Its effects were devastating. The strength and energy was zapped from those who heard it. It caused confusion, anxiety, and even miscarriages. This annual shriek of terror was naturally causing great concern to those who had to suffer through it. And so, that was when King Helid decided he needed to get to the bottom of the issue. Havelis, the king's brother and a king himself, was somewhat knowledgeable in magic and was quickly able to tell his brother what was really going on. The shriek, he claimed, was coming from a fearsome fight that took place during the night every May Day. The fight was between two dragons, one red and one white. The red dragon was native to the country, but he was being attacked by an enemy dragon wishing to conquer the land. The shriek came from the red dragon, calling out in pain and terror whilst desperately trying to free itself from the white dragon's clutches. And so a plan was hatched to put a stop to the dragon's battle. Following his brother's advice, King Helid created a trap. He dug a large dragon-sized pit in the centre of his land, and within it he put the best mead he could find and covered it all with a presumably very large linen cloth. Then he waited. And sure enough, the dragons fought, viciously ripping at one another, until, in their exhausted state, they fell into the concealed pit. And soon they were both asleep. It was then the king set to work, swallowing any fear he might have had about approaching the sleeping beasts. He pulled the cloth up and around them. The sleeping dragons were then placed into a stone chest that was finally buried deep into the ground of the hill, Dinas Emrys. And then all was quiet. Now, that could have easily been the end of the tale if the sleeping dragons had not been discovered sometime later. A young boy and his mother had been brought before the king, who was at this time King Vortigern. He had chosen to build a fortress in Snowdonia, an idyllic spot for his citadel. But during construction, the king had found that every day the fortress walls were built up, by the next morning the towers had collapsed. He consulted his wise men, who suggested a sacrifice. A very specific sacrifice. A boy born without a father. A search proceeded, and soon a young boy was brought before the king. The boy had apparently been born as the result of the union of his mother and a spirit, or as some suggested, a demon. As a result of this ungodly union, the young boy was considered not to have a father, and so, to fulfill the prophecy, he was sentenced to death. But that was when the boy spoke up, making the claim that could save his life. He knew what was causing the towers of the king's fortress to collapse. The boy bravely called forth the king's wise men who had condemned him to death, asking them if they knew what was buried deep below the hillock upon which the fortress was being constructed. The men shook their heads. They did not. And so the king was led to the hill, where, hidden beneath some rushes, there was a large pool of water. The pool was drained to the boy's instruction, Once the water had ebbed, a chest was revealed. But that did not satisfy, and so it was promptly opened, and sure enough, out sprung the dragons, who immediately resumed their battle. The red dragon was barely holding on now. It was badly wounded and nearing death. But somehow it managed to muster up all the strength and courage it had left, and finally drove its opponent, the white dragon, from the pool. As the white dragon hobbled away, the red dragon stood victorious. The boy turned to the king and revealed that there was more to what had played out before them than just a feud between magical creatures. The dragons and their red and white hues also foretold the future of the country. The red dragon represented Britain, and the white, the invading Saxons. The boy claimed that the time for action was now, and that the king, like the dragon, should drive the opposing force from their country forever. But who was this young boy, who, despite his age, already seemed wise beyond his years? He had impressed the king so much that he named the fort after him, Dinas Emrys, or, in English, Emrys's Fort. And that boy, Meridian Emrys, would one day go on to become one of the most famous sorcerers of all time, Merlin. So that was the story of the famous red dragon, whose majestic form you can see on the Welsh flag, even today. This retelling was based upon the version in the History of Wales by B.V. Woodward, and also featured elements from the Gatehouse Online Gazetteer. There are of course a few different versions of this tale. One particularly fun retelling suggests that the dragons, when buried, transformed themselves into pigs. Strange, but that would certainly explain how they were so easily buried in the ground. An excavation at the top of Dinas Emrys in the 1900s revealed the remains of a ruinous wall encircling the hilltop, the foundations of a stone tower, and a pool, much like those featured in the story. Apparently, the walls even showed signs of having been rebuilt several times. Thanks to the archaeological findings, we're sure that the site was almost certainly occupied by royalty, although it sadly seems so far no dragon remains have been found. So, what do you think? Were Merlin and a couple of dragons really responsible for the building of the ancient hill fort there atop Dinas Emrys? I find this myth a really interesting one, mostly because there is a lot of archaeological evidence to back up many of the main elements featured in the story. Whether the legend is true or not, the Red Dragon has certainly had a powerful influence on the country. Still desperate to learn more? Then perhaps it's time for a visit to Dinas Emrys in Gwynedd, northwest Wales, where you can decide for yourself if warring dragons once fought a great battle there. There's actually a National Trust walking trail you can follow that takes you up through the woodland, past a beautiful waterfall, and finally to the top of the hill. Just don't forget to pack your walking boots for this one. Now, if you're ready, we leave Snowdonia behind and travel on down through the country to the Cambrian Mountains. This next story takes us to a fascinating village in Wales that is named after a bridge, that is named after a local legend that we will learn about in just a moment. If you visit the town and ask to see the famous bridge, the locals might ask you which one, because there are actually 3, each piled on top of one another, when, presumably, the bridge below became unstable. Though in Welsh, the bridge is known as Pontafanac, the bridge on the Manac. Its English name has a far more interesting origin. This is the story of the Devil's Bridge. Once there was an old woman who stood desperately at the bank of the flooded River Manac, calling out to her cow on the other side. She wasn't quite sure how he had gotten there, but he was certainly stuck. The river was wild, bubbling and swirling. The woman called out across to her cow once more, but it panicked and stopped at the riverbank, unable to cross. The waters had risen up high, and it seemed as though there was no way that the old woman could get to her precious pet. The cow was very important to her, as it was her only source of income in her old age. Without him, she would be ruined. That was when a mysterious stranger revealed himself to her. She had not seen him approach, but he seemed happy enough to help her retrieve the cow. It turned out that he, conveniently, was quite skilled in bridge building, and so he agreed to help the woman by building a bridge across the river to help her retrieve her beloved cow. The woman was very pleased and willing to accept the man's offer, but she wanted to know what he would require in exchange. Without hesitation, the man replied that in exchange for building the bridge, he would require the first living creature to cross it. It seemed like a strange deal, but the woman couldn't imagine going on without the cow, and so she agreed to the deal. A satisfied grin spread across the man's face, and then he set to work. The old woman returned to her cottage, but she had her doubts. There had been something strange about the man. The way he had seemingly appeared out of nowhere and was so readily equipped to solve her problem. His knees seemed to bend in an unusual direction, and his feet appeared almost cloven. She needed that bridge to be built, but if her suspicions about the man turned out to be true, she was sure that the consequences could be much worse than just losing her cow. And so, she hatched a plan. The man called out. The bridge was finished. But before leaving her cottage, the old woman took a loaf of bread with her. She ripped off a few crusts and threw them behind her as she walked, and that was enough to entice her loyal little dog to follow her, down to the river. At the riverside, she met the strange man once again, and he revealed his handiwork to her. The bridge was magnificent. Almost too perfect. The man smiled, but the woman still had her doubts. She asked whether the bridge would be able to take her weight if she were to step onto it. The stranger replied, reassuring her that his bridge was perfectly strong and sturdy, but the woman wasn't sure. Could the bridge even hold the weight of the loaf of bread she had brought with her? The man laughed. Of course it was. The woman wanted to be certain, and so she threw the bread across the bridge, and that sent her little dog scampering after it, and across the bridge. The woman was happy. The bridge was sturdy, and as per their deal, the man could have the first living creature to cross the bridge, which, as of a few seconds ago, had been her little dog. The man's smile dropped. This was not what he had planned. The dog was of no use to him. He cursed quietly to himself, and then disappeared into nothingness. And that was all the proof the old lady needed. She was right not to trust the strange man, for he was not a man at all. The woman had actually made a deal with the devil himself, but he did not get his soul that day. And so the old woman happily crossed the bridge and was reunited with her cow and little dog, and they all, presumably, lived happily ever after. So, that was the story of the Devil's Bridge. The version of the story I've chosen to tell you today is based on V.H. Sykes' 1881 version. But there's a chance that this story might already be familiar to you, but not in relation to the Welsh Bridge at all, because there are actually several bridges across the UK, and the rest of the world in fact, that are also called the Devil's Bridge, and many of them actually share the same origin story too. It's difficult to find out which of these ancient bridges has the most claim to the story, although the original Welsh Devil's Bridge is certainly an ancient one. The original bridge was likely built between 1075 and 1200, the one above it in 1753, and the final iron bridge in 1901. And who knows, perhaps one day there'll be another one on top of that. The river that the bridge crosses is called the Mynach, which is Welsh for monk. Now, this river may have gotten its name from the monastic land that once resided by its banks, or perhaps from the man in the Devil's Bridge story, who is sometimes described as having been dressed like a monk. But did the devil truly appear that day? And which bridge has the truest claim to the original Devil's Bridge story? I think that one's for you to decide. If you're visiting Wales soon, perhaps make Pentarfynach village your next stop and see where this tale is supposed to have taken place. Travel across the bridge if you dare, but beware of what may be lurking on the other side. If you do visit any of the magical places featured in this podcast, we would love you to share your photos with us over on Twitter and Instagram at @thefaerie_folk. And that's Faerie spelled Faerie. Thanks for travelling with us today, and don't miss our adventures in the next episode as we travel to Devon to find out more about their hungry hounds and hairy hands. See you then! The music featured in today's episode was Galway from Incompetech by Kevin MacLeod. Sound effects were from freesounds.org.